Yo tengo un alumno ahí que se puso.
Y ahora estamos transmitiendo, por si acaso.
¿Ahora sí? Tengo un alumno ahí que se puso.
Y ahora estamos transmitiendo.
Listo. Bueno, luego de unos pequeños problemas técnicos, les pedimos disculpas por el inicio retrasado de este live con la profesora Francisca Folch. Francisca fue estudiante de la Facultad de Letras, también tiene un doctorado en el área de literatura, forma parte del departamento de literatura de la Facultad de Letras y dentro de los cursos que Francisca dicta está Poetry y Shakespeare, también con otras opciones de optativos de profundización también relacionados con el área de especialización de ella. Hoy día tenemos una charla cuyo nombre la denominó Francisca Who is Afraid of Poetry, así que dejamos a Francisca para que nos deleite con sus áreas de especialización con este entretenido live.
Muchas gracias, Loreto. Se agradece esa introducción. Voy a presentarles ahora, voy a cambiar a inglés, que es el major en el fondo en el cual estamos trabajando. So hello everyone. I don't know how many people are watching. What I want to talk a little bit about today is offer you an introduction to poetry, to the pleasures of poetry. My area of expertise, as Loreto was saying, is Shakespeare, which is my absolute passion, and poetry, which I've been teaching this semester. So what I'm going to share with you is a brief introduction to poetry via this PowerPoint that I have prepared for today. So if you'll bear with me. I was expecting a more interactive setting. So I had prepared something a little bit more interactive. So what I'm gonna be asking questions, but I'm probably gonna be answering them on my own, right? Given the new circumstances. And that's okay. But if anyone feels like they would like to chat and respond, I'd be happy to read those chats and see and sort of keep up with what you're responding to. So my title for this brief lecture today was Who's Afraid of Poetry, which is essentially the introduction that I offer my students on the first day of the poetry session. Why? Because I feel like a lot of people are afraid of poetry, right? I'm not sure if that's the case with everyone. I often have in my class students who write poetry, but in general, the feeling is that poetry, and especially poetry in English, is difficult, and students want to find what is sort of behind the poetry, what is the meaning of this difficult language, and they often start to consider poetry as a sort of riddle, which is not often the case, or which is not always the case. But if you are one of those people who are afraid of poetry, there's a name for you. It's a disease, apparently. And the disease is called metrophobia. So if you are indeed afraid of poetry, you're not alone. There is a group or a community of people who might be afraid of poetry with you. Now, some of our fear, perhaps, of poetry comes from these this romantic idea of poetry as something beyond our understanding and something that the poets have access to, a certain truth that poets have access to, that we regular people don't. And here are some of the definitions of poetry. And I ask my students to select the one that sort of resonates with them the most. So I have, the first one is by William Wordsworth, first generation romantic poet. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. In other words, you are full of emotion, but then you go home and you write it down in a collected, in a calm manner. You're not walking around and sort of crying while you write. The next one is also a romantic, also first generation, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And he writes, prose equals words in their best order. Poetry equals the best words in the best order. Then you have John Ruskin, a Victorian critic. What is poetry? The suggestion by the imagination of noble grounds for the noble emotions, which I suppose leaves out quite a bit from what poetry is allowed to discuss. And then we have Shelley, second generation romantic poet. Poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and makes familiar objects be as if they were not familiar. And Shelley has this wonderful essay called The Defense of Poetry, where he defends and discusses poetry as the best there is, and the poet as a sort of prophet that can see beyond, can look at the truth, and can present it to the people. So that is what that is what students sort of discuss in the first class. But this is romantic poetry. There's a whole other tradition of poetry. And some critics say that there is a sort of change. You have romantic poetry, then more classical poetry, and so on. And the classicist trend of poetry, which in the beginning of the 20th century was called modernism, went against the idea that you had to express emotions in poetry. And they argue that poetry is much more descriptive, much sort of harder, right? And T.S. Eliot, who is one of our most famous modernist, high modernist poets, argues in his essay Tradition and the Individual Talent, poetry is not an expression of personality, but an escape from personality, which is sort of the complete opposite, right? And then you have someone like T. Hume, who argues that the dry hardness, which you get in the classics, is absolutely repugnant to them being the romantic poets. Poetry that isn't damp, damp, humid, in other words, poetry that isn't about crying, isn't poetry at all. Verse to them, the romantics, always means a bringing in of some of the emotions that are grouped round the word infinite. And the modernists dislike the romantics quite robustly. Ezra Pound is the one that says, read as much of Wordsworth as is bearable, right? As much as you can, if you have to. A contemporary poet like Adrian Mitchell argues rather differently. Most people ignore most poetry because most poetry ignores most people. And I think there's been also a resurgence of poetry, of poetry which you find, sort of briefer poetry, which you find, for instance, on Instagram and on Facebook walls and that sort of thing. And there's also a tradition of slam poetry that has become increasingly popular of late. I quite like this version. this is Viktor Shklovsky, a Russian formalist, in his essay Art as Technique, and he writes, art exists that one may recover the sensation of life. It exists to make one feel things, to make the stone stony. The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and the length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. Art is a way of experiencing the artfulness of an object. The object is not important. In other words, it's not about the message that you want to show. It's just about describing the things and making you see them again. And have you ever had that feeling where you, for instance, take I don't know, this is my water bottle, right? You're like, you see something, you observe it, you observe it, you observe it, and all of a sudden you're like, I've never seen this water bottle before in my life. It is amazing, right? That feeling is what the modernists are after, what Shklovsky calls in Russian "остранение," and has been translated into most often defamiliarization. The notion of defamiliarization, making you look at it again. And that's why modernist language is difficult, right? Because it's making you really work at it. So we shouldn't be afraid of tackling difficult language or difficult metaphors. And Keats, second generation romantic poet, the romantic poet by excellence, who is just wonderful poet, died very young, so quite tragic. He has a concept called negative capability, and it's the ability to dwell in the realm of obscurity, of lack of clarity, and not be anxious about going after fact and reason. So it doesn't matter if you don't quite understand, just go with it and enjoy the language, the poetry, the difficulties. Some of the other things that I introduce when we're discussing, when I'm trying to make people not be afraid of poetry, which is essentially my whole objective in that class. It's an introductory survey class. So one of the first things I discuss is, when do we encounter poetry for the first time? And when do we become afraid of it? Because when we're little, we encounter poetry, I feel, quite often in riddles, in rhymes. And for instance, if you read, for instance, Alice in Wonderland, you'll see, for instance, this little nursery rhyme: Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again, which is part of this Mother Goose nursery rhyme. So we encounter poetry through rhyme, through the pleasure of just nonsense. And at some point, I don't know why, as teenagers or as young adults, we encounter poetry as being something more difficult, and we are like, why did Humpty Dumpty sit on a wall? Why did he fall? Who are these king's horses? And when we're little, we're just like, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. It's an egg. He's on a wall. Because, right? It's not important. It's just about the pleasure of it, the pleasure of the rhyme, wall, fall, etc. And that's what we need to recover, I feel, to enjoy poetry again. There are other very silly traditions, like the limerick. For instance, this one: there was an old man with a beard who said, "It is just as I feared, 2 owls and a hen, 4 larks and a wren have all built their nests in my beard." Now, if you try to analyze this, I don't know how far you're going to go. So I would just laugh. And the limerick, which originated with Edward Lear in the 19th century, became really popular also for quite naughty rhymes. like this one. There's an oversexed lady named White who insists on a dozen a night. A fellow named Cheddar had the brashness to wed her. His chance of survival is slight. I hope this is not the only thing that you remember from this brief course. This one is quite interesting to me, because one of the other things that I like to consider when you're reading poetry is the title. So often my students will I'll ask them, read a poem, and they'll skip the title. And often the title has either the clue or the element of surprise. So if we have a title like You Fit Into Me, we would expect something like a romantic declaration. You fit into me, we fit together, we're like two peas in a pod, something like that. Or you could go the sexual way, right? But in any case, it suggests union, right? And this is the rest of the poem. You fit into me like a hook into an eye, a fish hook, and open eye. This is a Margaret Atwood poem, quite violent. And the whole point, right, of the title is that it overturns expectations. We're expecting something romantic or nice, and you get this really violent image. Although obviously the expectation is that there's some sort of relationship, and in this case, the relationship has gone sour, right? Margaret Atwood is most famous for The Handmaid's Tale, but she just, was it yesterday, released a new collection of poetry, which I haven't been able to read yet, which is called Dearly. And I'm quite looking forward to seeing, the title seems nice, right? Dearly, dear, something like that. But given this setup, I don't know what to expect. And next I wanted to introduce a poet that I really like. I'm not going to take a look at this particular poem called The Red Wheelbarrow, but the name of the author is down there. So William Gallows Williams. He's a modernist poet, and he was also a doctor, like full-time doctor. And a lot of the poetry that he wrote had to do with this everyday encounter with people, with places that he observed in a very vivid manner. And his language is quite simple. So I'm gonna jump ahead from that one, and I'm gonna read this one, which I absolutely love. So we have, sorry. This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you are probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. Now, I love this poem. The only word perhaps we might not be familiar with has to do with the technology that has advanced. An icebox is a refrigerator, right? Because it used to be a literal icebox where you put blocks of ice to keep things cold. And this type of message, right, you would find perhaps as a little message, as a post-it, right, that you stuck on the refrigerator, telling maybe your spouse that you, confessing, right, because it's a confessional note, that you had eaten the plums that probably this other person was gonna eat for breakfast. And it's a sorry note, right? I'm really sorry I did this. But the last stanza gives it a little twist. It's forgive me, and then they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. So it's a kind of sorry, not sorry note, right? Because there's no real attempt. I mean, why is this speaker discussing the deliciousness and the sweetness and the coldness of the plums? And now we all want to eat plums, right? So it's almost like they were delicious, right? I don't know if it's mean or if the overwhelming deliciousness of the plums just was too good, and they tempted him or her, right, into eating the forbidden fruit in this case. And I put up this poem, and we have a fruitful discussion. Fruitful is good word for this. A fruitful discussion about what makes this a poem, because the language is really simple, and we could actually reorganize this, the layout, into a little note, a little prose note. And there's nothing behind this that I need to understand as a reader. I mean, the message is quite simple. There's a lot of speculation to be done regarding the relationship, regarding the tone. Is the tone apologetic? Is the tone malicious? Is it ironic? Is it does the tone change? Maybe the speaker starts asking for forgiveness and then sort of changes at the last minute. Like, I don't really care. They were delicious, so sweet and so cold. So this is again one of those poets, William Carlos Williams, that I love because he's wonderfully relevant and he is so approachable. We're not here in any of Keats's negative capability, right? We are comfortable with this sort of poem, I feel. But again, it's just so wonderful. I have it up on my fridge. It's a fridge poem, I think. Then you have these sorts of things. Concrete poetry. Concrete poetry is poetry that that plays around with the notion that you have to see a poem to understand the poem. And there are different critics who argue differently. Some say, like Amy Lowell, that poetry is a spoken art, that you have to listen to it. But then you have other poets, Huidobro, right, included, who work with concrete poetry. So for instance, this one, which Aram Saroyan describes there at the bottom as a poster poem. So this is a poem, is the premise. I don't know if you agree, disagree. There's a lot of discussion about this one. It's you could argue if you really wanted to sort of analyze. Let's overanalyze this one. It's sort of an M, but it's an N becoming an M, or the other way around, an M becoming an N. It's columns like a portal. Language is a portal. It's the best one is, this is an existential poem because it's actually saying I'm, as in I am, but it's the becoming into existence. I'm, which, sure. I mean, we can, and you can argue about this sort of thing for hours on end. Half of my class usually hates this poem, and the other half are like, all right, let's give it the benefit of the doubt, right? And then you have other modernists, as you can tell, I really like the modernists. This is Gertrude Stein. Did you watch the film Midnight in Paris? And again, I'm not expecting an answer since this is a lecture. But if you watch Midnight in Paris, Kathy Bates played Gertrude Stein, who had this sort of salon in Paris where she received all of these important artists, Picasso and so on. And she writes rather difficult poetry. Difficult in the sense, not that the language is difficult, but it's just, what does she mean? Tender Buttons is one of her collections. And in an essay, I think this appears. Rose is a rose, is a rose, is a rose. This is a really famous line by Gertrude Stein. And the language isn't difficult, right? We know Rose is a, but what does she mean? I have echoes here of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. A rose by any other name would smell as sweet. What is in a name, right? A rose by any other name would smell as sweet. In other words, what is in the name rose, perhaps? You could also argue that the rose, the name rose for this, so following Shakespeare, the name rose for the flower could be anything else. But it also discusses sort of the surface of language. And it questions meaning and transparency in language, which is something that the modernists are really concerned about, right? That up to the modernists, the idea was that there's a pact, right, between reader and writer and text. Writer is trying to say something, he writes it or she writes it in the text, and reader understands it, right? But modernists argue that that's not true, that you might want to say something and then the reader or your listener might not understand it. In fact, that miscommunication is the rule rather than communication, that communication is difficult, it's hard. And in this type of line, you'll see rose is a rose is a rose is a rose. It also reminds me of nonsense language, of language that is repeated as when you repeat a word, rose, 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 and then you're like, what does that even mean, right? It loses coherence. I like this poem quite a bit. This is Benjamin Zephaniah's. Benjamin Zephaniah is a contemporary poet, and he is very much sort of against the notion that only special people like Shelley can write poetry, right? This is according to my mood. I have poetic license. I write the way I want. I drop my full stops where I like. My capital letters go where I like. I order from my pen. I verse the way I like. I do my spelling right according to my mood. I have poetic license. I put my commas where I like. My brackets are right. I repeat when I like. I can't go wrong. I look and I see. It's right. I'll repeat when I like. I have poetic license. Don't question me. And as you can see, he sort of does away with spelling and punctuation and all the terrible things that we have to learn. Now, you have to learn the rules in order to bend them, right? To break them. But I just love that what he's arguing is you don't need to be particularly you don't need to have gone to Eton or Cambridge or to have the right background to be able to write poetry. This is a poetry of revolt, right, of rebellion. And that's the other thing with poetry, is that the layout is so significant. It needs to be written like this, just like I'm looking at. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense, right? Like if I just had read it and you weren't looking at it, then it made little sense. And the other sort of fun suggestion that I came across with Carol Ann Duffy, who used to be a poet laureate before, I think this year that changed, or last year. And a poet laureate is a poet that is designated by the government. This one is a British poet, but there are other countries who have adopted that idea. So you get paid to write poetry for official settings. And Carol Ann Duffy suggests that the text is the modern form of poetry, right? I tend the mobile now like an injured bird. We text our significant words. I reread your first, your second, your third. Looking for your small XX, feeling absurd. The codes we send arrive with a broken cord. I try to picture your hands, their image is blurred. Nothing my thumbs press will ever be heard. So again, it's a very visual consideration of poetry. Here is Carol Ann Duffy arguing the poem is a form of texting, is the original text. The poem is the literary form of the 21st century. It's able to connect young people in a deep way to language. It's language is play. And that's the other thing, whether you agree with this or not, poetry is the best place to play with language, because it's at least lyric poetry, not epic poetry, but lyric poetry is concise and it allows for so much experimentation. These are other places, right, where you can find poetry. Graffiti is one, blackout poetry, where you have a text and you black out the words that you don't like. And then there's this Google Poetics, where you type something and then it sort of, the autofill will give you different ideas. Which, I mean, it's, I guess, a lazy way to write poetry. We're talking about concrete poems. This one is quite fun. Sorry, the one about the window, where the window is created by the word window. And then you have the word wind. So is the wind inside the house or outside the house? Is it outside the glass pane, inside? Is it coming in, out? Is the door open or closed? The window, is a window open or closed? Then there's this one. Shel Silverstein is a children's poet. He wrote the terribly depressing book called The Giving Tree, which is horribly depressing. And this one is Lazy, Lazy Jane. Lazy, 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 lazy Jane. She wants a drink of water, so she waits and waits. Sorry. So she waits and 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 waits for it to rain. And this sort of poem works especially well with the drawing. If you didn't have the drawing of the little girl with the open mouth, it probably wouldn't work as well, right? So again, that's very visual poetry. And then there is, let me see if I'm going to use this one. This is E. Cummings. I really love, love, love E. Cummings. E. Cummings is also modernist poetry, but a very experimental one. And I love to use this poem because, and I challenge students, who would like to read this poem, right? And there's always fear, the metrophobia, right? What do we do? How do we read it? They'll go one, a, l, a, fal, s, one, l, ines, right? But the cool thing about this poem, and Cummings is very well known for his experimentation in poetry, is how do you read it? Do you read, where do you prioritize, right? Do you read one? Because you have the number one, right? One. If we leave aside the parentheses, you have one, then one, in S. But you can also read the first one as an L. L, let's skip the parentheses, L, loneliness. And if we read the parentheses, it says a leaf falls. So you can do one, or you can do one, a leaf falls, and then read loneliness. And look at this layout. So you have the leaf on the tree, one leaf, the leaf is going like this, vertical, one leaf falls, then it goes sort of, the wind moves it around, and then it lies down. It falls on the ground horizontally. So there's so much at work here in a language that is entirely so simple, and it's the sort of thing that you can use in high school, because it's all about it's a meaning that's constructed visually, but it's playful, that is exploring the possibilities of language, and it asks many questions, but you don't need to sort of go beyond the meaning of the actual words. It's more about what is the context here? Is it autumn? Does that mean autumn is sad? Are we sadder in autumn? Is this a last tree? Does it mean winter is coming? Who is the speaker? Is there a speaker? Because the other question is, do we actually need a speaker in a poem? Speaker is the lyric eye that we mentioned in Spanish. Do we need a lyric eye here? Or is this just a sort of a photograph, a visual photograph? I feel like I've already spoken quite a bit. So I'm gonna stop here and see if there are any questions. You can look up slam poetry, which is the other contemporary form of poetry. I have a slide here. Here we go, slam poetry. These are two that I find quite interesting. The second one is a collaborative poem, which I can put up on the chat as well if you're interested. But that was essentially it. The introduction to the idea of fear, of metrophobia, of why are we afraid of poetry and why we shouldn't be, because there are so many different types of poets and poetry. And I always say to my class, you can hate T.S. Eliot, for instance, who is difficult and hard and references all sorts of difficult words and myths and so on, but you cannot hate all poetry, right? You can hate Keats, God forbid, but you cannot hate everyone. It's right. You cannot. I hate language. You can't hate language. You can hate, or you can dislike one particular poet, but the range is so broad. It's a whole genre to be able to explore. So that's my invitation. Quoting Caliban, be not afeared, right? Be not afraid. There is poetry for everyone. Thank you very much.
Francisca, tremenda exposición, la verdad que muy versátil, se nota que te apasiona lo que haces. Tuvimos muy alta convocatoria con la charla, así que estamos muy contentos por eso. Yo creo que también ahí deben haber algunos followers tuyos.
Thank you.
Así que te damos las gracias por tu tiempo, por una gran presentación. Te reitero, se transmite tu pasión, tu lado quizás más actoral para poder hacer clases. Creo que eso se agradece cuando los profesores son tan versátiles, para no hacer algo quizás tan plano, y sobre todo ahora que las clases son en línea. Así que es una gran forma de poder tener a los alumnos expectantes con los cambios de voces y como... Así que...
Muchas gracias a ustedes y espero que haya mucha gente que postule a letras inglesas.
Así que quién sabe con quién nos podamos encontrar el próximo año, que a lo mejor los que tenían ciertas dudas a través de esta charla, que va a quedar guardada en el canal de YouTube de Letras UC, puedan despejar sus dudas o apasionarse más de lo que ya puedan estar encantados con lo que han podido averiguar de la carrera en esta Expo. Así que muchas gracias, Francisca, y quién sabe cuándo nos volvamos a ver.
Ojalá sea pronto. Gracias, Loreto.
Chao, que estés muy bien.
Chao.